Well, while that's happening, I'll give an introduction to what I was going to talk about. So I'm not going to talk about metrics, despite being from altmetrics. Neither am I going to talk about the altmetric score or anything in particular. What I did want to talk about is what we found out from looking at some of the raw data and some of the use cases, and especially around attention, which, as we've kind of heard before, is definitely distinct from things like quality or from impact. Here we go. So just to get one thing out of the way first, and everyone in this room knows it, right? But I'm going to talk about reputation and reproducibility and things, but I'm not suggesting that by promoting your work or some of the other things we're going to talk about later, it makes the work better, right? The best way to get a good reputation in research is probably to do good research. It's not necessarily sufficient, but it is a necessary prerequisite. So that said, building your reputation, I'm sure you've talked about this before, and coming into this session, you knew about it already, but I'll cover some of the basics. Like, why would a researcher want to build their reputation online or offline anyway? The thing we should remember is that it's tough being a researcher, right? So it's a bit better when you're older and more established, but especially as a junior researcher, there's a lot of competition for grants, for positions, to find good collaborators, all this sort of thing. So really, it's not surprising the researchers find any way they can to kind of get a little bit of an edge in a very crowded market. So you don't have to do it online. Lots of people don't. They can go to conferences. You can, do posters. You can reach out to colleagues the old-fashioned way. But lots of people do it online, and increasingly people talk about research on the internet and some of the different forms that we've seen already on social networks, on blogs, on more closed networks like Academia.edu or ResearchGate, this kind of thing. So one question I think is worth thinking about is, all right, so how much is promoting and disseminating work part of the journal's job? And is there a difference between what researchers think journals should be doing and what journals think they should be doing? So I think Melinda mentioned it before. I think it's a good point. I think it's maybe actually unrealistic nowadays to expect just that you can hand off your work. I've finished doing my research. It is now going to go out there and have a great life by its own. I'm going to move on to the next thing. My next grant has already come through and I'm going to work on a new project. I think researchers increasingly realize that they've got a bit of a responsibility to push things out, to promote their own work as well. But importantly, personally, and your views may differ, it's worth talking about in the questions, I think publishers do actually have a duty, or there's an opportunity, maybe, to add some value by helping researchers promote their work online. So the first theme, if you like, of what I was going to talk about is that when we're talking about promoting research, that can mean a lot of different things to different people. So I'll give you some specific examples. These are all examples that have very high altmetric scores, so they're kind of special cases in a way. It doesn't apply to all research, but they're good kind of archetypes. So here's the first one. The paper is, actually now I can't remember if it's PLOS or PNAS, but the paper is a universal word, like just the halfway through the kind of grunting, like that. So the researchers looked at a lot of different languages around the world, and they came to the conclusion that it was, and lots of different languages have the same kind of thing, and they speculate about how it evolved and this sort of thing. So it's kind of research, and this is partly why it's a special case, but it's research that has a very broad public appeal. The reason I pull it out here is not just because I think it's interesting research, though it is quite an interesting read. It's because the author, so this guy, Mark Dingemanser, is one of the authors, knew about promoting it and wanted to be promoting it right from the start. So they were incredibly involved in pushing the article out. They were tracking it from the moment it got published. They built a website, a standalone website for the paper themselves. They put up a video. Anytime people came in with questions on social media, they would answer it. They would add it to an FAQ on the website for the paper. And I'm not suggesting that every author does this for every paper, but I'm showing that they did it for, not to answer a particular question or to influence a particular group of people, but just to get the attention, right? They saw that there was value to them in kind of popularizing the research. So I wanted to contrast that to a paper like this, where the authors had a very specific goal in mind. So you may have heard about this research, even if you haven't seen the paper. It was an update to an earlier study that looked at did a literature review basically to see what percentage of scientific papers about climate change, agreed that it was man-made versus not. There's a very high percentage that agreed it was man-made. And actually, this paper was rejected by a couple of journals before it finally found a home in Environmental Research Letters. When it did get published, they had a very specific goal in mind for the attention that they wanted for it. They wanted to reach a particular target audience. They wanted to answer a particular question, right? They say our aim was to increase public awareness of this consensus, this scientific consensus around climate change. And the way they did that partly was by, for example, it was a part of a citizen science movement, but the way they got the funds to make it a way, for example, was to crowdfund on the Skeptical Science Bill. So they engaged with a particular audience online to do it. So those are two kind of slightly different types of attention that different authors have gotten. The other thing to remember is that attention is not all created equal. So sometimes papers can get lots of attention for bad reasons. So here's one again, you may have heard about it if you haven't seen the paper. So it's about dogs are sensitive to small variations of the Earth's magnetic field. It was an important paper to the authors. They worked in this field about magnetosensitivity for a long time, lots of different animals. But the reason this got picked up and kind of took off Christmas last year is because some journalists kind of reduced it to when dogs poop, they face northwards. Right, that's the message. So it's quite a funny message, and it went viral, if you like, got a lot of attention. But it wasn't anything the authors had done. They kind of lost control of it. Right? They never even said that in the paper. And they're not, they were happy that obviously people have read the paper and that maybe they'll laugh first and then think later. And actually this paper won an Ig Nobel, which is that's their catchphrase. But equally, it would have been better if they'd been able to get in front of it, perhaps, and shape the message, clear up, why are we actually studying this? Why is taxpayer money going on this research, this kind of thing. So, to cap that bit, I think, and again, this is worth talking about in the questions or later, but as publishers, we should, and here I'm treating myself as part of the publishing industry, but let's recognize that online attention is important for many authors, but that it's not a question of just getting a lot of non-specific attention for every paper. Lots of people want different things. We should help authors see when they're getting a lot of attention, and the reason you want to do that is in case the attention is bad. They need to jump on it and do something about it or get in front of it before it's kind of too late. And also finally, and this relates to the first point, but to just remember when we are promoting on behalf of an author, when we're helping an author promote work, to remember the attention is not the same as influence. Are you reaching a specific audience? Are you just trying to get your peers to hear about it? Is it popularizing the research? And that's not the same as impact again, which is some of the things that we heard about in the first talk. Actually putting some of the research into practice. So now I'm going to talk really briefly and quite quickly about the other part of today. Not reproducibility per se, but quality. Again, it's different to attention. This is what I imagine, I think I've shown this slide before, what I always imagine scientists online talking about a paper look like. And sometimes it works, so you can find examples on PubPeer. It's a paper published in PLOS Biology. It's picked up as a research highlight in Nature. It's been through peer review. But there's somebody there going on and said, okay, we had a journal club. Lots of points were raised about this paper. We think there's problems with it. Here's the system working, if you like. The lead authors come on and said, oh, yeah, you're right. There was an error. I'm terribly embarrassed. We've submitted a fix to PLOS Biology, and the correction is going to go up and all as well. So in that case, there's a system here of post-publication review has a lot of kind of baggage around it, but it is post-publication review. It's our researcher has looked at a piece of research that's already been published and put forward some good quality comments on it, and they've been addressed by the author. The record has been changed. The problem is, of course, that as you are no doubt aware, PubPeer in particular, but also anywhere really where there's anonymous post-publication review comments, ends up more like this. It's kind of a lynch mob where people say, you can't, well, I won't use the laser pointer, but in the middle there is a bit where this commenter says, it's well known to many scholars the commenter's misconceptions about the cited paper stem from his inability to understand basic physics and his poor grasp of elementary mathematics. So really, not necessarily collegial let's all improve science together, but really kind of ad hominem attacks. And I think that's because for post-publication review in general to be useful, we're missing a few components. So one of them is incentive, right? It doesn't happen a lot. Why does it not happen a lot? Because there's no reason to. Like, what's the benefit to you as a researcher to contribute, to talk about these papers, unless you're kind of building your personal brand? There's not actually a lot to it. Then there's a further thing about context. If I'm looking at an anonymous comment on PubPeer, is that someone important in the field or someone who, has really come in from nowhere and has some alternate axe to grind? And then finally, curation. So I showed before that comment. That wasn't a very nice comment. Do we want to, as a community, not just an industry, but keep the kind of tone of conversation civil at least? And when you put it in terms of, incentives and context, putting things in context and curating content, that actually seems like the kind of business that publishers are in. So is there actually, and this is an open question, I don't have an answer, but is it something the publishing industry should be pushing for? If you look at something like Academia.edu, so this is their new sessions functionality, right? So the reason I think there's some problems with this, I think they are on the right track in that, they're encouraging real names. It's associated with a profile. If you get involved in a session, that is then associated with your, the page with your picture on it and where you're talking about your work and this kind of thing, where you're presenting yourself, where you're building your brand. And it's invite-only groups. The way they moderate it is by not having it completely public. Right? It's a select group of people by whoever's saying we should review this paper. And Academia.edu can do that because they're one private company with quite a large user base. But actually, is there any reason we couldn't expand that and do it across just ICM Publishing, for example? So, we've got a lot of the infrastructure that Paul pointed out in terms of initiatives like ORCID. Is there a way that we can start encouraging people to get credit for these post-publication reviews somehow, to build the incentive part? I think that's part of the reason, or that's an area where new metrics tools and providers can help. Putting things in context is initiatives potentially like ORCID. They're explicitly not providing a profile page, but it is still, a disambiguated person that maybe we can hang different achievements off of. And then finally, on the curation part, maybe there is room for journals to get more involved into choosing, just like you would with, pre-publication review, to address, to look at these review comments and say, well, yes, we should include our, here the reviewer is just being a bit of an ass, so we'll ignore it, this kind of thing. So I'll end on that question for you and say thanks very much. The last thing I want to say is I've got special thanks to the winner there, just because they have a really interesting section on the website, which I hadn't noticed until fairly recently, called The Grain and the Chaff, where they've gone to authors where the paper's gotten either a lot of attention or a lot of citations, and they just find out the story about it, as well as the flip side, which is papers that have been retracted for some reason, and they get the kind of inside scoop on what happened after the retraction and what happened to the researcher. They actually talk to the researcher to get the story. So I thought that was very interesting, and it's worth checking out. Thanks.